you author a bill and you can have 4 co-authors. And I was religious about any bill that I had that was going to have any problems at all, of going getting a Republican and then finding a homophobe to be the joint author. This is good for families. It helps kids. It saves the state some money. It's a good conservative family bill. And I got so good at it that in about my 4th session, I would just walk to the microphone and I would just say, Mr. Speaker, members, this bill is authored by Warren Chisholm, Arlene Willamette, and Glen Maxey, the gay guy and the 2 homophobes.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. But today, our guest is not an Alaskan. He is a Texan. He actually grew up in a small town outside of Houston, like I did. Even his closest friends didn't think that he would ever have a chance to win an election in Texas as an openly gay man in the early 90s. His good friend, Governor Ann Richards, said, quote, "Don't do it. Even if you win, they'll never let you do what's important," end quote. Glen Maxey proved them all wrong. He became the first out gay man elected to the State House in 1991, and over the next 12 years, passed more impactful legislation than any legislator in Texas history. We are going to talk about how he did that today. I met Glen this past weekend at the Victory Institute's LGBTQ+ International Leaders Conference in Washington, D.C. He delivered an amazing speech. Here is part of that speech.
I'll start with just telling a little story about how I came to be a gay activist. Picture the time of November of 1985, and I have left being an elementary school teacher and moved to Austin to become a legislative aide for the dean of the Texas Senate, the longest serving member, Senator Oscar Mauzy. It's my dream job. I was not out as a gay person at all. At the very beginning of the AIDS epidemic, while HIV and AIDS was raging on the East and West Coast, it was just coming to Texas. And when the very first cases of HIV and AIDS, I saw a poster about volunteering to help the men as they were getting their diagnosis, and in most cases dying within a matter of months. So I volunteered and worked with 2 of the very first patients in Austin who had AIDS at a very scary time, when there were no services, no support systems, just people with their doctor and an impending death. About that time, our Commissioner of Health, Dr. Robert Bernstein, General Bernstein, our health department director, was asked a question at a news conference about what he was going to do about gay men spreading AIDS. And his answer was, I guess we're going to have to add HIV and AIDS to the quarantine list. Now, think that a Texas quarantine statute had been written in 1919 during the influenza and tuberculosis epidemics. It had no due process. It basically said that a person suspected of having a disease on the list could be arrested and held until they were no longer infectious. And the public health authority who would do that arresting were the county sheriffs across Texas. And when the commissioner made the announcement that he would ask the Board of Health to adopt a rule making it a quarantinable disease, gay men across Texas were very, very concerned about it. So Senator Mauzy represented Oak Lawn in Dallas, the gay neighborhoods of Dallas, and the phone began ringing, and it were gay men from Dallas who were asking if Senator Mauzy could do anything about it, this quarantine proposal. So at the end of the day, during happy hour, I went into Mauzy's office and sat down and said to the senator, "Hey, we've been having all these phone calls from Dallas about this AIDS quarantine, and they want to know if you can do anything to stop it." So he uh, said, "What do you think we ought to do, Glenn?" And I said, "Well, somebody needs to go to the health department and organize the hearing in opposition to the rule." He pulled his glasses down onto the end of his nose, looked over them, took a big swig of whiskey, and then said, "Well, young man, when somebody ought to do something, that somebody is going to be you." And so from my closet that day, I decided that I had to do something to organize a hearing. And I had no background in this at all. There were no AIDS organizations, there were no gay organizations statewide. And so I first went to a gay bar, picked up a gay bar rag, turned it to the back where they had a listing of what few organizations were, and found the National Gay Task Force phone number. I made a call and talked to Jeff Levy, the executive director, and told him I needed an expert witness to come to Austin, somebody who could talk about HIV and AIDS. And he said, "You ought to call Dr. Mathilde Krim from Sloan Kettering, the leading AIDS researcher in the nation at the time." Dr. Krim had just testified before the U.S. Congress, the first person to testify about it, the AIDS epidemic in the U.S. Congress. So he gave me a phone number, and I made a cold call. A woman answered and told her that I had no money to pay expenses, but would Dr. Krim be willing to come to Texas and testify at this hearing in a matter of weeks? The voice on the other end said, "Of course I would." And then I realized that I was actually talking to Dr. Krim, and she became my lead witness. I spent then the next weeks recruiting other people. I had a Baptist minister and a Catholic priest and a psychologist and some other doctors, some civil rights lawyers, and we showed up to testify against the quarantine at the health department. By the end of the day, with Dr. Krim long gone back to New York and my witnesses all packing up, the Board of Health made a decision to withdraw the quarantine proposal and punt the quarantine law over to the Texas legislature to rewrite it to put due process into the quarantine statute. So I was ecstatic that we had dodged the bullet and walked into the foyer of the health department, and there were a bank of TV cameras, one from ABC, one from CBS, and one from NBC. And of course, Dr. Krim had already left. My witnesses, mostly people in the closet, didn't want to go on TV and talk about AIDS because nobody was going on TV and talking about AIDS at this point in time. So the young legislative aide was pointed to by everyone as he organized the hearing. So I was surrounded by TV cameras and did my first national news interview. I went home that night, stood in front of my TV, flipping through the channels, and landed on the CBS Evening News with Dan Rather. Across the screen, it said AIDS quarantine in Texas. Dan Rather set up the story, and then it switched to a picture of me on the TV screen. To this day, I have no idea what it said because all I could see were big yellow letters across my chest that said Glen Maxey, gay activist. And with that, my mother saw me on the national news. Tens of millions of Americans, I guess, saw me on the news, and everybody who worked at the Capitol also learned that I was a gay activist. I spent a few minutes thinking about just denying it, but I thought I will never put the genie back in the bottle. And so I was out in Texas before the term outing was even in our lexicon. I went from the closet to being a gay activist in a matter of seconds. Nothing changed with Oscar Mauzy. He was a great progressive. He never mentioned it. But Senator Mauzy was running for the Supreme Court and would be leaving office at the end of his term. I had 6 job offers from senators, progressive Democratic senators at the time, and all of those offers went away. I found that I was unemployable, could not go back to teaching elementary school because nobody would hire a gay person to teach in the public schools, and I had no options at the Capitol building, so began calling the gay folks that I had met during this period in Houston and Dallas, Austin and Bexar County, and called a meeting at a friend's house where we came together, and I told the group that I thought we needed to have a full-time lobby and lobbyist to work on the quarantine statute and other AIDS and gay issues in the future. We wrote a proposal, and I took it and filed it with the Secretary of State, created the Lesbian Gay Rights Lobby of Texas. Over the next months, I prepared for the next legislative session. I founded AIDS Services of Austin, and the rest is history. 5 years later, I decided to run for the legislature in Austin to become the first openly gay state representative. In my second term, I became a member of the Public Health Committee, and by the end of my time, I was on appropriations and I was writing the budget for the Texas Department of Health as the first openly gay Texas representative.
Glen Maxey, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
What I want to talk about is the aftermath, because that was not part of your speech yesterday, which is you talked about coming out on national television to your colleagues, your mother, tens of millions of Americans. What was the fallout? What happened after?
Surprisingly, going back to the next day, Mauzy acted like it never happened. He's just oblivious to it. It was just like, keep your head down. If you're out doing anything.
Do you think he'd known or no? With total
I don't know. I don't think so.
Because he'd asked you to make a hearing, make something happen for the opposition.
But that would have been.
But he did that for everything.
Yeah, he was liberal. He was. Right. I mean, he had passed the Equal Rights Amendment to the Texas Constitution. He had repealed all the Jim Crow laws. He had done all the farm workers legislation. He was
right.
He was the guy.
But it was still Texas in 1985.
Yeah, but he also, drank like a fish. I mean, there's a million drinking stories of dealing with him while he's drunk.
What about your mom?
My mom, we had the conversation the night of, and then with my family, evidently they all knew. It took me a couple of years with my mom. I was on TV and I was on radio talk shows all the time as the lobbyist during the AIDS crisis. Kathy Cronkite, Walter Cronkite's daughter, was a personality in Austin on KLBJ radio, and I was on her show every several weeks doing another story or AIDS story or whatever. I was on KTRH, which was the biggest radio station for talk radio. You remember it? Mm-hmm. I was on KTRH all the time and on Texas State Radio at the Capitol on gay stuff and AIDS stuff. So I wish you wouldn't be on TV so much. And I said to her, I said, Mom, what's the last thing you saw me on TV about? Because I knew what it was. She said, I don't know. It's about some kind of medicine. I said, yeah. I got the Board of Health to pay for a drug called pentamidine. And I said, people take it who have AIDS, and it keeps them alive. And I said, within the next couple of months, about 15,000 Texans are going to be able to get a drug that keeps them alive. I said, if anything your kids could do, saving 15,000 people's lives should be something you'd be proud of. She had moved in a travel trailer down to Bolivar Peninsula, where she fished for redfish and flounder every day and lived in her little travel trailer in her retirement. She had all these senior friends And everybody that had ever put a hook in follower thing knew that her son worked at the Capitol and was good friends with Governor Richards, all of those kinds of things. And she just bragged on me about it. She's really proud of me. And all of a sudden, when I became the gay guy, she said, I just don't know how to talk about it. And I said, well, you just tell your friends, I work at the Capitol. I'm on best buds with Ann Richards. And I do civil rights work. That's all they need to know. They don't need to know. You don't have to talk about me being gay. And from that point on, it was like I gave her permission. Mm-hmm. And I knew that she had really got there. There was a lesbian couple in Austin that did a commitment ceremony and then asked the statesman to put their wedding photo and support gay marriage, just a commitment ceremony at one of the progressive churches, put their wedding ceremony. And the fucking city went in uproar about these lesbians ruining the day of all the other brides on the page and gay marriage, all that kind of stuff. This is before nobody was talking about gay marriage. We weren't even talking about domestic partnerships. And that happened in the summer. And I had a Republican opponent that November, and he was a Baptist minister, anti-gay. I mean, he was a homophobe. But it was great. I was going to win with 75% of the vote, and I just was ignoring him. But I get a call, and it's the Donahue show. Remember it?
Phil Donahue?
Phil Donahue?
Oh, yeah.
Before Oprah. It's the Donahue show, and they said, we're going to bring the lesbians. We'd like for you to come and your opponent. We're going to be on the Phil Donahue talking about gay marriage. Okay. So, this is a first-class ticket, paid trip to New York, a limousine. So I go and fly up on Sunday, and it's going to be live at 4 o'clock on Monday. So I call my mother, and I say, I'm going to be on Phil Donahue tomorrow talking about gay stuff. So if you don't want your friends to see it, you need to make sure y'all are all out fishing while Donahue's on. It's going to be live. Yeah. So I go to the Donahue show. It's great fun, and we do the thing, and I come home. This is before the election, and you have the election, and then I go home Thanksgiving, and I go down to the beach where she'd be, and all these old folks, and they're all like, "You were so great on TV," and I thought, my God. And I said, y'all watched it? And I said, yeah, your mother had us all over to watch it on TV. So it was really great. I really didn't have any downside in the real world. My friends, all my liberal friends, I'd become like the gay buccaneer.
Right.
I was something different. And then I ran for office, and I was the state rep and the gay state rep. And then my friends were all liberals, and I was the unicorn.
Tell us about your childhood and where you grew up.
I grew up in Baytown, Texas. Baytown is on the Houston Ship Channel. It's an industrial town. To give you a flavor of my childhood, when I was probably 6 or 7 years old, and my mother would tell me to turn out the light and go to bed because I was a voracious reader as a young child. I never complained about that because I could flip off the lights and open the blinds up, and the flares from the refineries were so bright that it was like daylight in my room. So I could continue to play or read all night long. By the age of 16, I recall driving across from Baytown to Houston, and you can take one route that goes across the Houston Ship Channel, and you have to take a ferry across the channel on the San Jacinto River. And I remember a ferry worker knocking on my window and saying, "You're going to have to drive all the way around on the freeway because today the ship channel is on fire from the pollution." And that was, of course, about a year before the Environmental Protection Agency came into being. So I had all of those kinds of things that happened in my life that sort of gave me a appreciation for environmental activism. Everybody in my family parents, my uncles, and then following my brothers and my sister all worked in the Exxon refinery. I was the only one that said, I'm escaping from this place when I get older. As a teenager, my sister got married to a young man whose family owned a rodeo company. And my teenage years began with doing things around rodeo stuff. Those were my first jobs of Saturday and Sunday afternoon going and kicking calves into the chute for the ropers to practice and messing around with the rodeo stock, working at a concession stand. I have a sort of a dark past in that in Texas, you have to be 18 to serve liquor, and at the age of 15, I was selling beer in the concession stand and got to know what a liquor control agent looked like, knew who they all were by the time they would check on us. Some wild times in the rodeo business. I, on 2 occasions, had guns pulled on me. But I think the most important thing out of that time in changing my view on the world is that we did what we call a traveling rodeo, where we would load up all the horses and the bulls and the calves and steers, and a group of about 20 cowboys would follow the trucks, where we had a portable rodeo arena that we would go into Louisiana, and mid-state Louisiana, very racist Louisiana at the time. And I was 16 or 17 years old, and I had a little Volkswagen Beetle, and I would go in front of the caravan of trucks and be the first phalanx of folks going to set up a rodeo. And we mostly did contracts with things like Black Catholic churches that would have a rodeo and barbecue and that kind of stuff as a fundraiser. And our group of cowboys were both African-American and Anglo. And this was, of course, in the 60s and 1960s, 68, 69, about the time that Martin Luther King was assassinated. Things were pretty hot and heavy on the civil rights front. And I would go and stop at a truck stop and order hamburgers for 20 and get everything done so that by the time the trucks would arrive, their food would be ready and people could eat and keep going. And I remember I saw all the cowboys coming into the road stop and the manager pulling out a shotgun and saying that they didn't serve N-word and that we would have to leave. And of course, had tables full of food, and we left, but not before all the tables were turned over as we walked out. And I thought that night I was going to lose my life in my first sort of blatant racism confrontation. I remember driving into Opelousas, Louisiana, and asking for directions to St. Martin de Porres Catholic Church. And the guy at the gas station saying, why do you want to go to that N-word church? My job was to find a motel that had rooms on both the front and the back so that we could slip the African-American folks into the motel. All that kind of stuff. It opened my mind to the South in the 60s. My family wasn't immune. I grew up with folks who weren't, let's say just overt racist, but certainly used the N-word. I didn't meet another African-American person of my age until mandatory school integration happened. And the first African-American people my age that I ever saw were kids getting on the school bus. I had just never been put in a position to even talk to somebody that was a kid. It was African-American or Hispanic. As a small child, I remember In my classroom, there was a girl that rode our bus, named Lupe, and I don't remember her last name, but I was the overachiever in school, and I remember always finishing my work and being assigned to help Lupe. And everybody said that Lupe was so stupid. Now looking back on it, I realized that she couldn't speak English. That was the whole why she was having difficulty, is she couldn't speak the language. And it's just those kind of things that I remember as they were happening. You're bought into this stuff. All the way back to my high school time, I was the bookworm kind of kid, but sharp enough to maneuver my way to try to be in with the popular kids in the right clubs and stuff. And so, I hung around with the football jocks and all those guys, probably for more reasons than I really knew back then. In PE class one day, as we're waiting for the class change, the bell to ring or whatever, and in the locker room, all of my friends putting together a trip to Houston. These are 16, 17-year-old high school boys for the purpose of to go roll the queers in Montrose.
And Montrose is the gay area of Houston.
It's the gay neighborhood. And this is why basically you go and you find some gay person walking down the street and harass them or get their money for you to go buy beer with. I always found an excuse not to go, luckily. But I flash forward 20 years later, and I'm in the middle of a huge battle on sexual orientation being covered as a hate crime in Texas, which was a 3-session fight back when George Bush was governor to try to pass a hate crimes bill. And during that time, getting to be great friends with the mothers of 2 gay men who had been murdered by high school students. It was just such a shock that I was so close to being part of that kind of hate.
Were your parents political people?
As a child, I remember my earliest political memory is going in to vote with the big electronic machines where you flip levers down. And I would go in as a child, and my mother would always let me vote the ballot all the way down. And then attending my first precinct caucus, our first step of our state party operation always were precinct caucuses that would happen on the day of our primary. And I remember going to the first precinct caucuses when I was a kid and figuring out fairly quickly that there were the good guys and the bad guys. And in Texas at that time, it was everybody was a Democrat. Mm-hmm. There were no Republicans. It was just Democrats. And of course, then it was liberal Democrats versus conservative Democrats. As the state over the next 30 or 40 years became more and more Republican, it really wasn't changing the people. It's just the conservative, mm-hmm. moss-back Democrat, racist Democrats, anti-civil rights Democrats started using an OR before their name.
Well, go ahead.
I was just going to say about my mom, the union was very good in messaging, evidently, because I remember in 1968 when I first got involved with politics or thought about politics. Of course, the Vietnam War was raging, and I was very much anti-war and therefore anti-President Johnson, even though
I was a Texan. Yeah.
A Texan. It was all about the war. I didn't see the good side of the civil rights movement and all that. I saw it, but it was still like the war was the thing. And it's just a harbinger of right now, young people about what's happening in the Mideast and how that reacts with Biden. They're not going to see everything else that's on the table. They're just looking at what's happening in Palestine. I was very much that way about the Vietnam War. And my very first thing in 1968 was suggesting to my mother that we should vote for Richard Nixon because of the Vietnam War. And I remember my mother just getting stony faced at me, and she said, Republicans have never done anything for us. She said, your grandmother's Medicare, my union job, and my paycheck are all brought to me by Democrats. And there's no way that we're ever going to vote for a Republican in this household. I said, oh, okay. I guess
Well, was the messaging that Nixon was going to pull out of Vietnam?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That was the whole thing. In 1972, when George McGovern, anti-war candidate, was running for president, I was a college student. And I'd gone to Huntsville, Texas, and got involved in the student mobilization committee and had been boycotting grapes with the farm workers and all of the stuff of the 60s. Participated in my first sit-in. Even in 1970, it's still a cafe in Huntsville, Texas that didn't serve by African Americans, and did my first sort of sit-in with African Americans at that to integrate that cafe. And so I was a little bit of a radical. I had hair down past my shoulders by this point in time, and I was barefoot, happy. The amendment had passed that lowered the voting age to 18. And I was already past 18, but hadn't turned 21. So I benefited from it. But of course, everybody on campus could get registered to vote. So Huntsville was a dry county. Mm-hmm. And for those who don't know what dry county, in Texas, you have wet counties and dry counties. A wet county, you can have an election and you can say the county can sell beer and wine. And then you can have another election to allow people to sell hard liquor.
Alaska understands this very well.
And another election to have liquor by the drink. And so Huntsville was totally dry. Of course, when the voting age went to 18, the drinking age went to 18. So it was legal to buy alcohol. But so a group of 2 or 3 of us decided that we would do a petition and call a liquor election in both the city of Huntsville wet. And
even though you didn't drink?
I didn't drink. But it was an election. It was politics. The other thing that happened that year was the first year that Texas allowed people to become deputy voter registrars. And there was a lot of stuff happened around that time about students. Now, we're 18, they could vote, but the voter registrars in all the college towns refused to let students vote in the college town. They said, no, you have to vote back in your hometown. We had to litigate that. The case that it was happening at all the universities, but the African-American university was where it was the worst. They were not going to let any African-American students, because the students would outvote the townspeople in Waller, Texas, at Prairie View A&M. So the case came out of Prairie View, went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, where they ruled that students can vote wherever the damn well they want to, wherever they slept. And so that case is a voting rights case out of Texas, and 18-year-olds could vote in college. And then deputy voter registrars came into being, which meant you get deputized to register other people to vote. And so I went to the courthouse and became the first, or 19-year-old at the time, deputy voter registrar. And then we called it a lecture election, and we put up a booth under a big magnolia tree by the student union where I registered voters. And then I registered everybody in the dorms, door to door, and then registered everybody in the frat houses and sororities. And so very quickly we had more students registered on campus than townspeople. And I had an election, couldn't get a single townsperson to sign our petition to call the election, but the election passed in every precinct. And so immediately I was a hero.
And y'all made Huntsville wet?
And made Huntsville wet. And so 18-year-olds could drink. Texas liquor laws were such that immediately we had 4 bars open, and each one on a different night had a drink specials. There were 2-to-1 drinks, or 3-to-1, 3 drinks for the price of 1, or nickel beer nights. Every night there was a different bar that had nickel beer. I was told by the administration of Sam Houston State University that the highest flunk out rate in the history of Sam Houston happened the year I voted it wet. Yeah. I mean, everybody partied.
Were you proud of it?
I was 19 and 20. I was a big, fuck yeah. It was great. But that was the first election.
Can you tell us about the first time that you were a delegate to the Democratic National Convention?
In 1976, we had our first presidential primary, and it was called the Lloyd Bentsen primary. We had our primary for the first time because Lloyd Bentsen was running for president. He was our U.S. Senator. He later became the Secretary of Treasury. He was nominated as Vice President of the caucus, even though they were unsuccessful. But he was, let's just say, a conservative Democrat. And I was not a Lloyd Bentsen fan. So I wanted to qualify for the ballot. It's going to be a slate of Bentsen delegates, a slate of Wallace delegates. And I was working to do an uncommitted slate. So you didn't have to vote for either Bentsen or Wallace, that you can be elected as a delegate uncommitted to then help one of the progressives that were running in other states, because they weren't running in Texas, we thought. And so I had to get 500 signatures, and I talked to other liberal folks in other counties that I'd met at previous state conventions, told them they were supposed to be getting signatures. So I got 250 signatures on the A&M campus because I was living in College Station. And we showed up in Austin at the Secretary of State's office, and the other people were coming, bringing their signatures, and we put them all together, and we had 495.
Oh, no.
And I was just like heartbroken that we messed up. And there was a young man, a 21-year-old kid. I was at that point like 22, 23. This 21-year-old kid walked up to me. His name was John Poland. And he said, I'm the state coordinator for Jimmy Carter. And he says, we qualified him for the ballot by just going into Baptist churches and getting signatures. And he said, I'm looking for delegates to run for Jimmy Carter. And he said, if you don't do it, if you don't help me get people in your district to run for Jimmy Carter, it's all going to be just old white Baptists going. And I said, oh, I don't know anything about this guy. I never heard of Jimmy Carter. I go back to College Station, and I hold the perfunctory meeting to come up with the 3 delegates. And in that primary, the delegates' names were on the ballot. Mm-hmm. Listed out, Glen Maxey and Dr. Holcomb, and it's the 3 delegates. So there were 3 Bentsen people, there were 3 Carter people, and there were 3 Wallace people. The Bentsen people were the chairman of the Texas Democratic Party, the executive director of the state party office, and some millionaire guy. Well-known, name ID, political, everything. Well, along the way, and by the time we get to the May primary, Bentsen had dropped out. And so Carter was on his way to get the nomination. So the primary happens, and I win a seat to the national convention.
Wow.
As a kid, never been out of the state, never been on an airplane, never had anything like that.
Where was the national convention that year?
New York City. We fly to New York, and on the airplane going up, a reporter sits down next to me, and I didn't know who he was, and I was a kid. The Brian Eagle had done a story, his big banner headline, kid goes to the national convention. So I've been in the local newspaper and on the news in town. And then on the airplane, I do this thing. And so when we land on Saturday, Sunday morning, in New York Times, new story on the front page of the Times was about this first-time delegate from Texas. So I'm on the front page of the New York Times. We rock along to this convention. And it's the convention where Barbara Jordan gave the keynote, which was a big deal on the first night. Sunday, I got interviewed by a Time magazine reporter. So there's a special edition of Time that came out on Monday, and I have a story in Time about the first-time delegate. So at this point, everybody in the delegation is giving me all kinds of hell about being a publicity hound. But, I was 22 years old and all shucks, I don't know what I'm doing here. And I said, everybody else should get on TV. And they said, how do you think we could do that? This is when, during the 76th convention, the city of New York was going bankrupt and we're asking for a federal bailout. And President Ford had said New York City can drop dead. And so we're in New York City. We're having a great time. And they were looking for any kind of publicity they could get. I said, why don't we do some placards? It says, Texas thanks New York City, and hold them up during the vice presidential roll call. I start out finding a stack of Jerry Brown for President posters that were blank on the back. And being an elementary school teacher, I sit and I color letters this big that spells out Texas thanks New York City. Simultaneously for this, knowing that I'm still an anti-war person, the biggest issue of the convention, controversial issue, is amnesty for the Vietnam draft evaders who were living outside the country. And there's a big movement to try to put that in the platform. Carter campaign was having nothing of it because they didn't want to have that as the news headline. And anti-war draft evader amnesty folks figured out that their process of getting attention to this, the only way to get time on the podium was for us to nominate a Vietnam draft evader for vice president. So there's a guy named Fritz Seefaw he got elected as a national delegate from the Democrats abroad and had come to the convention, got arrested. They got him out on bail. So now he's on bail and he's at the convention. And so it took a petition of 200 delegates to nominate him. So I signed that Fritz Seefaw petition. Governor Briscoe, governor at the time, and the state party chairman, Calvin Guest, the guy who I had beat to be the Carter delegate, he's the state chair. He was a banker in my hometown. I'm from Bryan at the convention.
You're living in Bryan at the time.
And he's the head of the savings salon in Bryan. There was no love lost between me and Calvin. And then he found out that I had voted for Fritz Seefaw, and he was in my face saying, you're not going to embarrass Dolph Briscoe. He's not going to stand up and say a vote for Fritz Seefaw for vice president. Of course, the nominee was Mondale, and I was for Walter Mondale. I had no problem with Walter Mondale. And I probably would have voted for Walter Mondale, except for the Calvin Guest said it. And he came to me, had me cornered, and he put his finger in my chest. And he said to me, young man, if you vote for this goddamn Fritz Seefaw, I'll make sure that, and he's just hitting me. Mm-hmm. You will never do anything in politics in Texas again. I will blackball you, and you are over. I said, yes, sir. And so when the vote came, Fritz Seefaw, and I am sitting in the delegation, and I am actually in tears, thinking that was the stupidest thing you've ever done, Glenn. He's the most powerful Democrat in Texas. He's going to fuck you over so bad. And then it was we were at Texas, and all of a sudden I realized, I have to stand up with my sign. It says Texas thanks New York. So we hold up the signs. The New York delegation's in front of us on the floor. Mm-hmm. Everybody's looking at Texas. They see the signs. They start cheering. Mm-hmm. This convention is so tight on time because in 72, the keynote was given at 2 a.m. And they had said no demonstrations, mm-hmm. nothing. It's going to be, Jimmy Carter's going to give his stuff right on time. So the signs went up and the orchestra began playing The Eyes of Texas. Then the orchestra played New York, New York. And then I looked up and Bob Strauss is the DNC chair. He's from Texas. And so Strauss is back at the podium and he's with Mayor Abe Beame of New York, and they're holding their hands up, this New York thing, Texas thing. So it's like a 15-minute demonstration. And as soon as it's over, I get this thing, it's Calvin Guest needs you. And I said, fuck that. I thought about getting my ass ready. I'm not going to go see Calvin Guest. I've been through that, Bill. And they said, you've got to go. And so they grabbed me and dragged me down there. And I get there, and it's Governor Cuomo, Governor Briscoe, and me talking about Texas and New York. And my parents get to see me on TV. And I go back up to the delegation, and it was TV camera after TV camera and TV camera. And it's always, who organized this thing? And then this white-haired guy shows up, and he says, my name's Paul Dwyer, and I'm the president of the city council in New York. And I'm inviting you to come to City Hall tomorrow morning to get a key to the city from the mayor. And
oh my God, the rest of the delegation must have hated you.
They did. Oh, yeah. And at that point, the chairman of the New York Democratic Party shows up and says that nobody was to go back to our hotel, that the whole Texas delegation was going to the top of Rockefeller Center to be the guest of the New York delegation, which then I could have been elected to anything because there was free alcohol at the premier party in New York City.
What did Calvin think?
So the key of this thing, at that party at Rockefeller Center, Calvin Guest comes up to me, and I'm thinking, now I'm going to get it. And he says, young man, for anybody who, now keep in mind, I just got Don Briscoe on national TV.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, Calvin Guest was his right-hand man. You got to be party chair back then by being the governor's person. And he said, I want to just let you know that if you ever want to do anything for politics in Texas, for standing up for what you believed in, to what I did to you, call me.
Now, so he reversed in the same day.
In the same day. However, that's 76. I run for state representative the first time in 1982. Still in the closet and still in
College Station, Bryan, Texas is where you were running for.
I was a teacher, and I run for state rep, and the chairman of the House Appropriations Committee was retiring. He was from Bryan. His job was head of the Texas A&M University Foundation, meaning the major group that raised all the outside money for the university.
Mm-hmm. And he was a Democrat?
And he was a Democrat. He's retiring.
It's an open seat.
Open seat. And I decided I want to run. And I'm 28 this time. And
28, but everybody knows you in the Democratic Party. In
oh,
Texas.
yeah, because I'm doing convention stuff and campaigns, coordinator for governor candidates. I'm a mover and shaker in the party, but I'm just 28 years old. And I filed for office, and I start fundraising money to file for office. Had no idea who else is going to be in the race, but it's an open race. And then at the very last moment during the filing period, it's announced that Bill Presnell's decided he's going to run for another.
Oh.
And I have no idea whether that was because they thought I would win. And
they didn't want you to?
I was too liberal and too progressive and all that kind of stuff or whatever.
Did they suspect you were gay at that point?
No, I'm totally closeted. My only thing would be at conventions doing stuff with the delegation, but I wasn't out. I got beat clearly by the chairman of the House Appropriations Committee, where everybody who works for the university and everybody in town works for the university. That's all College Station was. The whole district is Bryan-College Station, and everybody worked for the university. But I did debate the chairman of the House Appropriations Committee at WTAL Radio and sat across a little table about this size where actually our knees touched under the table with Bill Presnell, and realized in doing it that he was the appropriations chairman, but his whole time in office, lobbyists told him what to do. He didn't know jack shit about any policy other than
outside of what he did.
Talking about education or environmental stuff. And so I ran circles around that man. And I thought, I could do this. I got beat. And what happened that election night was me thinking about how difficult that campaign had been. Like, if you were to win and represent College Station, I'd already had to really tiptoe around abortion stuff and other sort of
So you're having to like moderate because of Bryan being a more conservative place.
Yeah, I couldn't be who I was at all. I was not running as an authentic Glen Maxey,
right,
where I really believed at all, because I was much more liberal than I was campaigning. And I was slipping into gay bars in Houston by this point in time. I'll never be able to walk in a gay bar again.
Hey, so full disclosure, I came out in high school. I grew up in a suburb of Houston, Friendswood. And I remember being 18 and still in high school. And I drove to Montrose and I parked my car and I walked around and I didn't know where I was going and I didn't know what I was doing. It was pre-internet. I have that history.
We all do.
I'll never forget, like, some car pulled up and drove up and some lady rolled down the window and she was like, "What are you doing?" Because I looked young and I was a young looking 18-year-old. I said, "I don't know. I'm looking for a bar that I could go into." And she was like, "You got to come back on a Wednesday night. And that's 18 and up night at this bar. And you could come back." And so I remember getting in my car and driving all the way. It was like an hour home.
I remember the stories, a couple stories about going to bars. First one is while I was still teaching, this would have been, 80 through late 80s before I moved to Austin. And there was a single bar in College Station called a Strop Tease, and then a Peanut Gallery. It had about 10 names just in the 8 years I was in there. It was just a
gay bar in Bryan, Texas?
Yeah, in College Station.
In College Station?
It was really small. It was cinder block building, no windows. Everything was black, painted on the inside. It had a little bitty dance floor. And I lived out in the country between Navasota and College Station, and I taught in Navasota, which is about 30 minutes south. And the bar was right on the edge of College Station going into town. So I would park like 4 blocks away and come through the neighborhood and go.
So your car wouldn't be parked in the parking lot?
Yeah, because
people know.
Navasota would drive right past. It was on the highway. At my elementary school that I was teaching 5th grade in Navasota, the principal and the vice principal were both ex-coaches. And the vice principal was the disciplinarian. He's the one that did all the corporal punishment and all that stuff, which I just hated. But he was a bruiser of a football coach kind of kid guy. So I remember one night I am leaving the bar and I open the door and I'm face to face with the vice principal of my school. We never mentioned it again. Never
Wow.
said again.
Did you say hello?
No, I just went like right past it. Like, never mentioned it again. Luckily, that was my last year of teaching. When I got beat in that campaign, I got hired to go back to Austin to run the coordinated campaign, work for Jim Hightower, was running for ag commissioner, populist candidate. It was the last year that Democrats won every race up and down the ballot in Texas. Ann Richards was elected state treasurer, a guy named Jim Maddox for attorney general, Bob Bullock for lieutenant governor. So whole liberal Democrats, Benson for U.S. Senate, Mark White for governor, Bill Hobby. So every elected official was a Democrat. And all the statewide below the top 3 were liberals. And it was the heyday of politics. When I worked for Caperton, it was a redistricting year. And Caperton told me that my most important job that I had was to befriend the staff of the senior member of the Senate, Oscar Mauzy, and to go down to Mauzy's office because the maps were actually being drawn. This is before computers. So the paper maps and data is all being done in Mauzy's Senate office. So I go down, and his chief of staff was a woman named Millie Bruner, who was on the DNC at the time. She was a big muckety-muck of the Democratic Party. And clearly she didn't want to do any work. Now, I had met her over the years at conventions and all that kind of stuff. Helped her in her DNC race at the convention. So we were friends. And Caperton's thing was, we're lowest in seniority. If there's a squeeze somewhere, our district's going to be it. We're going to lose.
So be friends, be in there, make sure that doesn't happen.
Make sure that doesn't happen. Report back if it's going to happen. So I was just a total spy. But now I was in the room where it happened, where the map making is. And Millie Bruner says to me, well, if Caperton will let you, why don't you just come down and actually just draw the maps? I spent most of my time that session in the senior senator's office with a round table, a 10 key, big computer printouts that had just basically population of a precinct, had no demographic information, and then maps, colored pencils, trying to draw congressional districts and then Senate districts within 1% deviation. Nightmare.
It's a nightmare, but I also think not having that demographic information would, by default, probably make a fairer map.
It did. What I had happen was a progression of white senators coming in and saying on a map in Dallas, Houston, see this creek right here? Everything over here is black. Put all that in my district. All this over here is Hispanic. Put that in my district.
The Democratic senators wanting to maintain their advantage.
So I'm now trying to color on a map where blacks and Hispanics live. It was awful. I would draw the map and I'd get to El Paso and I'd be off by 3%. So I had to take these counties over here to put them to El Paso. And I soon learned you started in the tip of Texas and went north, and you started at El Paso and started the Panhandle, go this direction, and then just make it collapse.
So in the middle, you could fix it up.
In the urban areas. Mm-hmm. But it was hours and hours, to the effect that there would be times during the session when I'd get a phone call from a more progressive House member's office, staffers, and saying, you have to stay up all night? And I said, I'll be here all night long. And they said, great, come up. So I'd go up and get a bump of cocaine.
Go back to work.
Then make it through the night. Statute of limitations expired on all of that long ago.
I take it you made sure Caperton's district looked good.
We had no problems at all.
I assume you got a job with Senator Mauzy because they liked your work on redistricting.
I got to know him then. When working for Hightower in 82, and it's the general election happened, it's election day. About noon, I got called, and it was Mauzy. And he said, what are you doing tomorrow? And I said, oh, I'm unemployed. And he said, come to the Capitol. He said, you're going to be my legislative aide. When you took your Texas government class, you probably read, and didn't inculcate it to have it in your memory, the case that created single-member districts for the legislature in Texas was Mauzy versus Carr. He was the plaintiff as a trial lawyer in a lawsuit challenging the state of Texas because up to that point in time, all urban counties elected their state representatives countywide. So in Harris County, there were 25 representatives.
Oh my God, they were at large, like they were for the whole
county, and they were all white. Mm-hmm. There were no single-member districts. So Mauzy did that case. It was decided in 72. So 73 was the first election with single-member districts, and the first time the legislature went from 1 or 2 African Americans and Hispanics to 25 African Americans and Hispanics. And so that was his claim to fame. So he had been in office from 73, in the Senate from 73, and we're now at
83 or
83. But he said to me that when I get there, I realize I'm the only legislative staffer. Millie, who doesn't do anything, and me. He was chairman of a committee, and he had 5 staffers on the committee because that was all he was doing was jurisprudence stuff because he was a trial lawyer. And,
So it's like judicial committee, judiciary.
so he's doing all of the judiciary stuff. And then there was just me as his other legislative aide and a receptionist. So I asked him, I said, so what am I going to work on? What are we doing? And the other thing to know about Oscar Mauzy is that he was a raging alcoholic at this point. Teddy bear. But I was told when I got hired, my job description included at 5 o'clock, no matter what was going on, I was to have a bucket of ice, butter seltzer, 5th of Maker's Mark scotch on his desk. And if he's in a committee and if they're at the height of the committee at 5 o'clock, gavel went down and it was adjourned. And he came to his office and he started drinking. And we had what was called happy hour with the good guys. And every day, Senator Mauzy would invite in for drinks the members of the Senate, members of the House that he considered good guys on that day. And it was one of those situations where every mover and shaker who had ever graced the Capitol building would come. There'd be 15 or 20 people there every day. And I was the bartender. And stories would flow, and they would drink and tell stories and plot. Everything that ever happened in the legislature was plotted in Mauzy's office over alcohol. And I had to keep up with the list of the good guys of who couldn't come because they had pissed him off or voted wrong or whatever. But it was fascinating. I got to be chummy best friends with the governor and the lieutenant governor, and Ann Richards became one of my best friends. And
So Ann Richards was one of the good guys who was coming in to have drinks.
Oh, yeah. They had been family friends in Dallas. Her husband, first husband, ex-husband at the time as she was governor, but Dave Richards was a civil rights lawyer and was the lead lawyer in all of the redistricting cases of Texas for the last 30 years. He's not 90 years old, so he's not anymore. But Mauzy, of course, was in the thick of all of that redistricting stuff. So they were law partners and hunting buddies and all that kind of stuff. But it was a fascinating time, and I learned so much. Mauzy said to me that first day when I said, what are we going to do? And he said, I don't care. He said, you go find yourself a legislator program, whatever you want to do. And he also said, and you need to learn the Senate rules. And he said, the number one thing that's important for you to learn is not really the rules, but how to get around the rules. And I'm going to teach you that. So he became a mentor, taught me the rules, process, strategy. And that session, he passed 58 Senate bills.
Wow.
Never read a single one of them.
Really? They were all yours? You did all that work?
I did everything. And for the most part, he was able, as the senior senator in a Democratic House, a Democratic Lieutenant Governor, whatever he filed was going to pass. Mm-hmm. People walk in and say, hey, we want to create this state park in the Trinity River bottom. I said, great, we'll do it. You know, I just agreed to everything. And what I didn't know at the time was that the senator had a running appointment for lunch on Wednesdays at noon with an old flame of his, where he and this old woman would drink, and he would get so drunk that he wouldn't come back. And that afternoon were the two biggest committees of this House. And of course, I was carrying all kinds of election stuff, and that committee met. So I had to become able to, A, get a bill set for hearing in a different committee, then B, go to that committee and get a different senator to lay out Mauzy's bill. Mm-hmm. I remember when a young man, State Senator Chet Edwards, who was my age at the time, he was in the Senate and from Waco, and I'd gotten him, because he's the same age, he'd already laid out 15 Senate bill, Mauzy bills, and he kept saying, I'm not doing another one. I was on my knees on the Senate floor next to his chair, said, please lay out this bill. But So the biggest compliment I ever got was, at this point in time, the legislature in Texas, it was wild and woolly. No computers still, nothing's online. And we met for the 140 days, went to midnight on the last day. And so you're still voting on legislation all the way till midnight, to the traditional thing of the clock in the back of the hall is the clock. And at some point in time, about 11:40, some poor Senate messenger was held by his ankles always to turn the clock back so it would never hit midnight. It was wild and crazy. And so that first session, without computers, we tracked legislation on these big poster board that had all the steps the bill could take. When it's filed, when it's set for hearing, when it's laid on the table for the first time, it's all done by hand. And so I had this thing that was literally 12 foot tall. I had to get on stand on a chair to do the first bills that I'd filed, as I kept adding stuff to it. So we did 58 Senate bills and picked up maybe 35 House bills and took them through. So over 100 bills that passed, almost all of it. And so the last night of the session at midnight, Mauzy had the good guys, which was pretty much at this point the whole Democratic caucus, because we'd just gotten through session. Of course, at that point, nobody knew what anybody else was doing because nobody had a concept of what was going on. And so I remember all these senators in there, and Senator Uribe from the Valley, after a couple of drinks, he looked up and he said, fuck, Mauzy, did you really pass that many bills? Mauzy looked up like he had never seen it before. And he said, no, I didn't do any of that. That's Senator Maxey did all that.
I just want to be clear. That was 100 bills attributed to Mauzy. I was thinking that was how many had been passed in the Senate, but that was just
Mauzy.
Your office. That's crazy. That's insane.
It was insane.
I think I had asked you earlier, I said I wanted to talk about how you personally were able to pass so many bills. I think this was your boot camp.
It was totally boot camp.
Yeah.
So when I went got collected at the House, I walked in knowing the rules of procedure backwards and forwards and knew the tricks of the trade. And
yeah, that's so interesting.
in my first session, everybody yelled, vote no, it's the queers bill. They voted, people voted no on a memorial resolution for a dead Catholic priest.
Because it was your bill?
Because it was my bill.
Because that's what I was going to ask, is how you got around that. Like, how did you go from having people say vote no on the queers bill to passing all your bills?
The story really is the last session as a lobbyist for LGRL, I had a lobby day in March. We had 40,000 people on the Capitol grounds.
Lesbian Gay
Rights
Lobby.
We had about 40,000 people on the Capitol grounds, and on a Sunday afternoon, and about 500 of them I got to stay over for lobby day. And I had gotten the three most liberal members, the Montrose representative, the Oak Lawn representative, and the Austin representative of what became my district, to do a memorial resolution for people who died of AIDS. This is 1989. And the resolution was read and voted on. It's always unanimous on a memorial resolution. And then there's a traditional motion where somebody's at the back mic and says, Mr. Speaker, I move to add all members' names to the resolution. So that happened. And I'm watching as there's a procession and a line at the clerk's desk. And I had a sneaky suspicion what was going on, but then I went to a member's office right after they adjourned and said, what was that about? And they said they were taking their names off the resolution because you can go to the clerk and remove your name. 58 people did.
58 people. How many were there total?
150.
Wow.
And I was pretty devastated by that. They got some retribution, and every newspaper in the state
Wrote their names down. Who took their name off?
Box on the front page of the Houston and Dallas paper, the members who removed their names, because it was just such a chicken shit thing to do. And So when I got elected, those historic desks are like old school desks that open up, put things in them. So I took that list of 58 people and I blew it up. And I opened my desk the first week I was in office, and I taped it inside that desk, closed the desk back, and also every day took out of my desk a rainbow flag and put it on my desk. It stood on my desk every day of the 12 years I was in the legislature while we were in session. And I got lots of people saying, it was so great to go to the legislature and see that rainbow flag sitting out there. So I took that list, and every day I would go down the list, take the next name of somebody I had not talked to. This is when I was a freshman and the queer. Mm-hmm. And I would watch that person until I saw them walk out into the open. Mm-hmm. Not at their desk, but out where they couldn't get away from me. Mm-hmm. And I'd walk out and I would put my hand out. Mm-hmm. And I'd wait for them to take it.
Mm-hmm. Did you have anybody not take it?
No. Sooner or later, everybody did. They would hand me. Then I wouldn't turn loose of it. Mm-hmm. And I would say, "Hi, glad to meet you. How's your family? Tell me about your kids. You're a dairy farmer?" I don't know nothing about dairy farming. Of course, I was a rodeo guy. I knew something about animals, but I don't know nothing about dairy farming. I said, "Do we even vote on dairy farming shit here?" Hey, let me tell you this. If a dairy bill comes up, come to me. Because if you tell me about it, I'll be a good vote. And I did that over and over. And then my second thing was to all of the really right-wing people is to look what legislation they had and see what they had
that you could support,
that I could support. And I remember Arlene Wilgemuth had gotten elected. She was the chair of the Christian Coalition and the House Conservative Caucus. She was vehemently anti-gay, but she also served on the Public Health Committee with me. And I needed her on committee, so I would always go to her. We didn't agree on anything, and get her to understand what I was doing. And then, of course, we have a thing of you author a bill, and you can have 4 co-authors. And I was religious about any bill that I had that was going to have any problems at all, of going getting a Republican and then finding a homophobe to be the joint author. This is good for families. It helps kids. It's for disabled kids. It saves the state some money. It's a good conservative family bill. And I got so good at it that in about my 5th session, I would just walk to the microphone. When you lay out a bill and just lay it out and explain it, I would just say, "Mr. Speaker, members, this bill's authored by Warren Chisholm, Arlene Wilgemuth, and Glen Maxey, the gay guy and the 2 homophobes." I had them on about 20 of my bills. I would just say it. I said, "Move adoption," and I'd walk away, and everybody would vote for it because they would go like, "We don't even have to read it. If they agreed, it's going to be all right." The other thing that I did, and it was helpful to me in my legislative career, is that in my 2nd session, after I'd gotten past being the queer, we actually had a speaker's race. And there were 3 candidates. There was a guy that represented Oak Lawn, the gay district of Dallas, David Kane. He's in the race and had about 25 commitments of the liberals. And then there were 2 white guys, both Democrats, conservative Democrats, both from the Panhandle of West Texas. It made no difference to me. If David Kane couldn't be speaker, it didn't matter to me. The race had deadlocked. The election happens in November. The race is going on. We go into session in January. And so now the campaigning, behind the scenes campaigning, is at a fever pitch. And so P. Laney comes to see me, and he says, wants to talk to me, and say, "How long do we have?" And he says, "An hour." And I said, "Okay, I want the whole hour." He said, "Okay." And I said, "I don't want you to talk. I don't want to know about you. I want you to hear about me and what it's like to be ostracized in my office." I said, "I have 125,000 constituents like everybody else, and they need me to do their stuff, and I'm not able to." I said, "I've never seen the inside of the speaker's office my whole freshman year. Never got invited into the speaker's office. Never got invited into a meeting. And I said, so I just want to be able to play because I know that I can do this stuff. I just need all these impediments out of the way. And I said, those 125,000, I said, I have another million constituents all across the state. I see those fall counties over there, that's nothing but constituent work for people who are not my constituents. So let me tell you about the most recent one I did, Pete Laney. Young man, 24 years old, within weeks of dying. He's on probation from a drug charge. He wants to go home to Atlanta, can't leave the state because of his probation. So I got him transferred to probation in Atlanta. He's already dead. This is 91. It's still, HIV is still raging. And I said, so let me tell you about that young man. I asked him the same question I ask every other LGBT or person with AIDS that's called me. Have you called your state representative? So you know what he told me, Pete? He said, fuck no. My representative is Pete Laney. I said, that's what I do every day. I finally said, I'm through. You can get up and leave. I said, you take the weekend. And if you think I can be a member that has no impediments coming from the speaker's office or none of the impediments that nobody else has, I'll be your vote. But you got to call me back and tell me that. And I ushered him to the door. So I got a call from one of his lieutenants the next day, and he said, what the fuck did you do to Pat Laney? I didn't do anything. He said he didn't want to be speaker unless he had your vote. So what can we do to get your vote? I said, Mr. Laney knows what he needs to do to get my vote. He owes me a phone call. So the next day my phone rings, and it's Laney, and he said, there will never be an impediment. In fact, I will tell you right now, I can't do you any favors. He said, I'm not going to give you special treatment, but you will never have a problem. I said, okay. And I said, there's the other thing. All the fucking liberals, we had all campaigned on ethics reform and rules reform of the House because it was so bastardized and things happening. We voted on an ethics bill at 12:05 a.m. my freshman year that was not even written. We voted on it, and then they wrote the bill after we adjourned. And I said, so all the young freshman legislators, about 20 of us, had been working on some rules reform. And so, I said, you've got to make a commitment on those rules. That was part of the deal too. And so he called me up and he said, no, I want to fix the rules. And I said, great, then you have my vote. So I called David Kane and I told him I was going to go with Laney. And then I started calling the other liberals and said, I'm moving. He's told me he's going to do the rules reform. Y'all need to talk to him, but y'all need to commit because he's going to go over and need to be on the team. And so everybody, all the liberals went to Pete Laney and I made the speaker. And then right before Christmas, I get a call about, can you come to the Capitol tomorrow from his chief of staff? Mr. Laney's having a meeting about the rule, rewriting the rules. So I go, first time
To the speaker's office.
to the speaker's office, and I go and it's all the senior members on his team. They're all going to be committee chairs and all of that. And the looks on their faces when I walked in, the gay guy, was like, what the fuck is the queer doing here? So Laney comes in, he says, I want y'all to talk among yourselves and do the outline of what we need to do in rules reform. So I want to do all the things that have been talked about, intercession rules. Now a bill has to have passed 3 days out. And you're only doing amendment or conference committee reports the last 2 days and only doing corrections on the last day. The biggest thing I had was that everything was paper. And I said, everything in the legislature has to be online. You can't vote on anything until it's been posted online for over 24 hours. So there were all these process rules. And then probably the most conservative guy in the room, he says, how do we know when we got it right? And this was the blessing. Laney stood up and he said, I got to go, but you'll know you'll have it right when Representative Maxey says that he'll be the author of the rules proposal.
And that was like your seal. You were in.
I was in.
Glen Maxey, thank you so much for being on the show today. We did not get to everything I wanted to, but we got to a lot.
Yeah, they can read the book next year.
Yeah, I look forward to the book coming out.
Yeah.
Do you have a name for your book?
Somebody ought to.
Somebody ought to. That's good, because that's what Mauzy
So the
told
train
you.
through it, every story starts with a sentence. Somebody ought to work on a voter file in East Texas. And then I tell about my voter file stuff. So everything starts with somebody ought to.
Thank you so much.
You bet.
I'm going to conclude today's interview with the very last little snippet of Glen Maxey's speech from Saturday.
So as I look out over this audience today, at the twilight of my time as an activist and as after I've now retired from the legislature, I see all of you that are elected officials, activists, and I have a word of advice to you. I know that every year, as you do this work, you will be in situations where you're going to see a situation or an action that needs to be done, and you're going to think, somebody ought to, whether it's somebody ought to take the action or somebody ought to organize a rally or organize an organization to deal with something. Somebody ought to run for an office to take out non-supportive elected officials. When somebody ought to do it, that somebody's going to be you. Always know that there's nobody better to take on the mantle, do the battle, than you yourself. And I wish all of y'all a great future in doing so.
Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email eastanchoragebookclub@gmail.com.